Thanks for joining us again here at Kyiv Post. My guest today is the very distinguished former US Ambassador to Belarus, Daniel Speckhard. Remember, click the subscribe button and don't miss out on our exclusive content of the war here in Ukraine. Thanks for joining us at Kyiv Post today. You're the former United States Ambassador of Belarus and now the CEO of Corus International. For our audience at home, can you just explain the important work that your organization carries out here in Ukraine?
Thanks, Jay. Absolutely. Corus is working to provide shelter, humanitarian relief, food, healthcare services to the displaced people in Ukraine. As you know, there's really about 7 or 8 million displaced inside the country and about equal number of refugees that have left. In some cases, we're also providing cash support to some of the displaced folks, and we're working with the Ministry of Social Protection. In particular, we have a technology subsidiary that's providing technological support to help provide an interface for all the international nonprofits and humanitarian organizations working in the country to help funnel our support in a coordinated way.
Mm. And you've been to, you told me before we came on here, you've been to Kharkiv. You've been to quite a few places in Ukraine recently. Kharkiv, as we discussed, has been very heavily hit, and it's probably one of the most important places to go to see the destruction and the impact on people living in Ukraine inflicted by Russia's invasion. Tell me what you saw and how has it impacted your view of this invasion?
Yeah, well, we have a partnership there with the emergency services groups in that area, and I have to be honest with you, it was amazing to see what they were able to do during that period. These are the firefighters and ambulance people and the hospital workers there. They essentially were trying to put out fires in the middle of the war when the Russian advance came. As you see it, the destruction is just enormous, right? Building after building that has been fired on by artillery shells or tank shells, gutted the suited walls of the fires that have been put out by these brave firefighters. As a result, huge numbers of people have been pushed outside their homes. You'll see sometimes in these buildings 1 or 2 lights on in a building that you're not even sure is really safe anymore. But the rest of it all had to flee. We're supporting some of those displaced people not far outside the city. What I saw there was especially a high number of vulnerable, elderly, and disabled people, right? A lot of the refugees and displaced people that are able to move much further west, hoping they'd be much safer that way. But if you're in your mid-70s, you're alone, if you need a walker or a wheelchair, these are the people that were kind of left in that area and couldn't get further to go. And, they are not just physically traumatized, but psychologically traumatized as well. Many of these people had spent literally months in a basement as the Russian forces came in, and then the Ukrainian forces pushed them back in that area. And they've come from the villages to this area. And as a result, you just start talking to them. I'm sure you've seen this, Jay, as well. And the tears just start to flow, even if it's been months ago, because the horrific nature of their experience has so left a strong imprint on them. And when you think about that across the entire country, it's important probably for us to remember this country has had an enormous psychological toll as well as a physical toll. And that one's a little bit harder, right, to support.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? When we think of humanitarian aid and the things that people need, we think of physical objects, we think of water, we think of food and shelter, but we forget that, these people have been, as you say correctly, psychologically damaged, and they're still having to deal with that. Do you think that there's enough support at the moment, or do you think that it's impossible until the war is after to get the amount of support that is needed to give these people psychological help?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is, of course, there's going to be a lot more support needed, in particular because Ukraine doesn't have a strong culture and tradition of therapy or therapeutic support in terms of how they view it, psychological counseling. There's going to need to be some changes in attitudes there. What I did see that was inspiring is the communities coming together to support each other. So an amazing, amount of neighborly support. When we were visiting some of these shelters in the West, these people were from all over the place: Zaporizhia, Mariupol, Kharkiv, right? They didn't know each other before they landed here. And they came to, and they're sharing everything they have. They're supporting each other's and each other's kids. They're doing whatever they can. I see that happening all over the country. That is part of healing, right? To be honest with you, trauma psychologists will tell you one of the most important ways to overcome trauma is through community and the support and love of those around you. So there's things are happening, but in terms of the deeper psychological support, that's much less. We have, that's part of the services that we're providing, several psychologists that we're supporting that go from the shelters to shelters. And what's nice to see is they're getting completely filled up in terms of the people wanting to use their services. We also just launched a new mobile health unit. It's almost like a truck. It's got 3 offices in it. And one of those offices, 2 will be used for doctors, but 1 will be used for a therapist. So this is happening. What your news outlet can do, though, is make sure people understand it's normal to have really strong psychological reactions to this. And there's a sign they put up in these shelters that says, war is not normal. Any of the feelings you're having, those are normal, right? So it's the situation that's abnormal, and their reactions, they should feel that their reactions, if they're feeling like they're going crazy, that's normal, right? And the more we can encourage people to do that and to get help, seek support, I think if we can help change that attitude, that would be good too.
You're completely right, and you touch on something that not many people discuss. To be fair, the normality. Something that struck me when I was in North Saltivka was it was heavily shelled every single day and night. It was different in the sense that the sirens just stopped playing because there would be no point, because they would be playing constantly. And yet I noticed people they seemed to accept it as a normality. Not everyone, we can't see inside their minds and going, but people were walking through the streets going on as normal. And it was quite strange to me how quickly we adapt to a siren going off. At first, when we hear it, you get the goosebumps, and after that it becomes normal. But as you say, it's completely not normal at all. It's not normal to live in that environment. It does. I do think that perhaps, sadly, after the war, it might hit a lot of people, of what they went through, and it might sort of come on tenfold. So it's something that, amazing organizations such as yours are doing such a vital service. What do you guys need? What are you short of? What do you need from the general public? Obviously, you have.
Well, I can tell you, we do distribute material resources, things like that. But any organization, not just ours. The reality is, find a good organization that you trust and care about, and give them resources, money, right? Because it's the most effective way to get help into the hands of people, right? And so that is the most powerful thing you can do. Resources are important. I know you think your government's helping, but the challenge are most governments are much slower than nonprofits, right? The embassy folks in our embassy, they get stuck at the embassy, and they're actually, many of them are in Zhezhov across the border, whereas our nonprofit people can get all over the country, right? And don't have the restrictions that the government is placing on travel and things like that. So I encourage you and your listeners to support your favorite organization, provide donations and resources to make sure they can keep operating. It's going to be a tough winter. I'm sure you know that from your travels around the country. I think we're even underestimating at this point in time how challenging it is going to be getting through this winter for many, many families.
And how can people, if people watching this wanted to donate to Corus International, how can they do that? Sure,
just corusinternational.org. There'll be a little donate button on there that you can go to. So Corus, that's CORUS, international, all one word, .org. So we'd really welcome more partners in this effort, have a strong commitment to getting all your resources and support, particularly to the most vulnerable. That's one of the things that we're focusing on. There's a lot of displaced people, but some of them have resources, but then these ones that we're talking about, there are some of these people who have nothing, right? They're elderly, they're disabled, they're orphans. Those are the ones that we have to make sure don't get lost in the cracks. And those are the ones I'm particularly worried about for the winter. Because as the the cold and the snow closes everybody down, you don't know how cold it is for somebody who's kind of left in their little stayed in their village house, or it's in a basement somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Our goal is to help find and support those folks.
Yeah, 100%. We've heard horror stories from places like Mariupol, you know, where people have been cut off at times from clean water, from electricity, all the basic essentials that we just take completely for granted. So that, you know, that is where it steps in for the humanitarian organizations. So let's touch upon now, obviously you were the former US ambassador for Belarus, and a very successful one, if I may say so. If you can give us a general overview of what politics is like in Belarus at the moment, you know, what our audience at home might not know the situation with the current leader, what happened to the previous, the opposition leader. Obviously, he's no longer in Belarus. His wife has tried to stand. We're actually interviewing her soon. What was your general view? I know it's a broad question.
Yeah, well, I think the challenge is for your listeners to understand that Belarus is one of these countries that I felt could have gone either way at the end of the Cold War, right? Belarusians are different than Russians. Belarusians are a peaceful people. They have been a land that has been occupied and run over by invaders from throughout its history, from Germans to Lithuanians to Russians, on and on through history. And they're essentially just want peace, right? That's what they want. And there was a period in time where they could have been much more Westward leaning, but the current president won an election early on. That was actually a pretty fair election at that time, but then he quickly turned the country into much more of an autocracy, an authoritarian type government. The reality is that it's made it very difficult for opposition in that country. There's only a small opposition that can operate, and it struggles to survive over these decades. I don't see much hope in the near future for change in that country. It's such a tightly run place. And the reality is the vast majority of the people, as I said, aren't interested in politics. They're just trying to survive, right? And it's too scary to stick your head up to look over the fence. You just keep your head down, do what it is you need to do to keep your family fed, supported. So,
why do you think Belarus, and particularly their current leader, is so pro-Russian? What is your overall thoughts on their attitude? Not all Belarusians, of course, but the regime's attitude towards this invasion in Ukraine?
Well, there's two separate things. One is overall attitudes toward Russia, I think, just are from his lifelong experience. This is a president who hasn't had a lot of international experience, right? He was the director of a collective farm before he became president of the country. His lifelong experience is essentially very similar to a Russian experience. And he has strong affinities, as many Belarusians do, to the culture, the history, and the aspect of that. So I think in general, that's the only thing he knows. Doesn't have an experience that takes him outside that. In terms of the current thing, though, I don't think the current administration in Belarus has any interest in getting sucked into this war, right? And so President Lukashenko is walking a tightrope, trying to make sure that he does enough to appease the Kremlin, that he doesn't pull somehow Belarus into a situation of conflict with Russia, but at the same time does not pull his military and his population into a war with Ukraine.
And what is that? So the West, particularly people in the UK, they might not understand the capabilities of Belarus's military. Can you give us an oversight of, you know, does Belarus pose a serious threat to Ukraine? Should it get more involved in this war?
Not in terms of numbers. You know, Belarus is a small country. Its military is not, it's relatively small. It does not have a lot of sophisticated equipment, does not have a lot of high-level advanced training, does not have a lot of special forces. So I think in terms of numbers, it's not that significant, won't change the tide of the war. The challenge, of course, is the size of the front, right? And this is a two-edged sword in the sense that if there was another front to be opened up for Ukraine that they had to deal with, which is all of its northern border against Belarus, you probably have another, I don't know the exact number, but 1,000 kilometers or more of new potential front that you have to protect the country against that extends well into the west. So that's a concern. You also then have a country that borders directly with NATO countries that is hostile in the situation, like Ukraine, to NATO countries. So that also would change the dynamics geostrategically for Europe. I don't see that happening. You can never predict Russia, what Russia is going to do, but Russia will have the same problem, which is, I think in general, NATO allies are probably warning Ukraine not to go into Russian territory, not to attack Russian territory, not to try to expand the conflict beyond it, because they're concerned about how the Russians will respond if it goes onto Russian territory. That's not the same for Belarus, right? So it would be a strategic mistake, I think, for the Russians to encourage through Belarus to open a new front, because you don't know how it's going to go, and the Ukrainians could just push back into Belarus if they had a success, and it's not the same as pushing in to take Russian territory, if you understand what I'm saying. And so I think this is I think there's reasons for both Ukraine and Russia not to want a new front on the Belarusian side. But it's totally unpredictable when it comes to Russia and the Kremlin, right? You use rational thinking, and sometimes it just doesn't serve you well.
Yeah, no, that's the problem. Putin is so unpredictable. What are your thoughts? Obviously, and whilst you were the US ambassador to Belarus, were your thoughts back then the same as they are now? You know, what do you think about President Putin?
Well, I was also, I spent 5 years after Belarus at NATO as Deputy Assistant Secretary General for NATO, so I still had a lot of time, and one of the responsibilities I had there was the NATO-Russia relationships. Before Belarus, I was the Deputy Ambassador at Large for the broader region that included Russia. So I've had a lot of time to kind of think about Russia, watch the developments there, and my sense is this is something that's been a long time coming, right? This is not some new thing. This is something for 20 years he's been thinking about, which is that his goal has been to be the leader that reconstitutes the Soviet empire, not as the Soviet Union, but as the greater Russia, Russian empire, right? And so I'm sure from his perspective, he views this as a fluke of history and a sad failure in Russian history that past leaders like Boris Yeltsin and others, probably more particularly Gorbachev, allowed this collapse to happen. And he was going to reconstitute Great Russia, right? And so he was watching for his time to do that. What surprised me is he ended up using overt military means, right? Because this is not his area of expertise. His area of expertise is covert. He comes from the KGB. And that's what he had been very effective at, right? He's undermined US elections. He's undermined European elections, changed governments here with the interference in our democratic systems. He has been working hard to do that in Ukraine. And then the Ukrainian people kind of rejected the moves that he had there. I still, I think what you're going to find at some point in this war is that he's going to get tired of the conventional war. He's going to push it back into some sort of stalemate, and then he's going to go back to his covert techniques. The piece I worry about, Jay, is that this tax on the infrastructure of the country, right? It's not, I don't think he really thinks he's going to crush the morale and spirit of the Ukrainian people and they're all going to put up white flags. I think he has a longer strategy, and the strategy is that he knows that over time, if they suffer long enough, they'll start blaming their own political leadership.
exactly.
They won't blame the Russians, but they'll blame the people in Kyiv for not paying enough attention. That Kyiv's getting all the resources. They have more electricity. People in the subsidiary towns have less. And that'll start fracturing the political dynamic of the country, and you lose the unity on the political side, which is so necessary to have a successful defense against the Russian aggression.
And perhaps not just Ukraine. You know, we've got to remember that by attacking infrastructure here and by sort of essentially using the Nord Stream pipeline, for example, to essentially blackmail Europe, is it not turning Europeans and people in the West against supporting Ukraine? Because, you know, we're seeing prices rise, and there have already been protests in some regions. Let's focus on America, where you are. What are people saying at the moment about the energy crisis, and is that affecting their stance on support for Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's much different here than it is in Europe, because energy prices haven't risen so dramatically as they have in Europe. So we haven't really felt the same kind of crunch that our European neighbors are feeling. So not yet on the energy side. I think more here, the bigger challenge is politics. We're in the midterm elections here, a week away from that, and that could fundamentally alter some of the political landscape. There's already been signaling by some of the Republican leadership and others that they would have to reassess the amount of assistance or support going to Ukraine, because we need to preserve more here or at home, or the issue of immigration is a more important issue and needs more attention, and so forth. So I'm not overly worried about that. I think support for Ukraine will hold in the long term, because the cause of Ukraine against Russian aggression, to Americans, this issue of freedom and liberty is such a fundamental issue that people fighting for their freedom against a big aggressor is something that resonates very strongly. But in terms of the size of the resources, the amounts, and so forth, it'll be more challenging, and everything slows down. You know, if the Congress changes here to pass any piece of legislation, will take twice as long.
Do you think it is going to change? Do you think the Republicans could take the House?
You know, I'm not. I'm the wrong person to ask. But what it seems like there's a lot of momentum here for that to happen. I think the odds are that the House switches to Republic, and the Senate is 50-50 in the sense of whether it'll switch or not. But it's a weird election, Jay, in the sense that, again, I don't know that the polls really tell you what's going on, because the issue of pro-life, pro-choice abortion rights is playing very heavily into this particular election in a new way that we haven't seen before. And so it's not really clear how that's going to play out. And you have a very fractured Republican Party, with the Trump arm and the more centrist arm still trying to fight over center of that party.
We're seeing a lot of conspiracy theories, pro-Russian conspiracy theories, coming out of the Republican Party from candidates, from politicians such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, a few others, and it's spreading rapidly on social media. Why do you think that is? Why are there so many pro-Russian conspiracy theories being pushed within the Republican Party?
I think there's truly a direct link. I don't mean direct is the wrong thing, but I think they're being fed and supported by the Russian misinformation efforts through the covert channels, right? There's a huge amount of resources being spent on that. And it doesn't take much to create an interesting story. Many of those extremist groups that follow these things, they're also the ones that are, reading stories about aliens and, and UFOs
wondering
and everything else. So it's much more, and it's partly a sign of our times, right? The stories are so much more interesting if they're bizarre.
We've got every day.
It's the TikTok generation, and we're kind of capturing the more crazy the story, the more likely you are to send it on to the next person, as opposed to, just some boring factual news story. So I think it's not that hard to feed these things. Second, there's a bigger issue here at play, and that is that part of the Republican Party is very isolationist. So they have a bigger agenda. The bigger agenda is less about supporting Russia or supporting Ukraine. It's about staying out of the rest of the world, U.S. first, America first, and focusing on the challenges here at home. And I think that kind of plays into that as well. Then.
I think that, you know, there's quite a heavy element of populism within the Republican Party as well. It seems to, sometimes I have to wonder if some of these politicians actually, and I have to stress, it's not every Republican, of course. It just seems to be a fringe, very pro-Trump group. I know I keep talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene, but, you know, every day it's sort of QAnon-esque, anti-government, it's anti-mainstream. It's like anything that brings up some quirky story, or, you know, if they suddenly ponder whether Humpty Dumpty really fell off the wall or if he was pushed. It's just absolute madness. And it seems to be Twitter and social media isn't regulated enough. You know, we forget that this actually has real impact on here. It's having a big influence on people in America, but also in the UK. And some of them now are, a large amount are talking against Ukraine, you know, trying to say that we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine based on these tropes and things pushed by the Republican Party. But moving on to something else, there was a group of Democrats recently wrote a letter. Now, I'll stress that it wasn't actually submitted in the end, and they said that they didn't intend it to, but it was written to President Biden calling for America to focus on pressuring Ukraine and Russia to negotiate. Russia has obviously taken land from Ukraine in the east. It's very unlikely that Putin is going to enter any negotiations without saying, well, we'll be keeping this land. Ukraine is not going to allow that to happen. Do you think that any negotiations are possible at all? And if so, on what grounds?
It's a good question, because the reality is the generals will tell you it's very hard to solve these things on the battlefield, right?
Yeah.
And the amount of death and destruction and harm that you and I have seen by going across the country kind of reinforces the cost of war, right? Yeah. So what you saw, I'm sure, by that wing of the left parties here in the United States is kind of an anti-war, more pacifist kind of approach, that war seldom leads to good results. At the same time, what I also saw in Ukraine is that feelings were hardening, right? That the more Russia pounded Ukrainians, the more they felt in the injured party, and that they weren't going to allow this to stand, and they were going to fight until their country was free and whole again. Yeah. And so, you know, the number of people that we're not just talking about getting the new occupied territories back, but completing the removal of Russians from the eastern occupied territories, and then talking about Crimea, they've set themselves a pretty high bar as a result of this, which is the irony of the result of what the Russians have accomplished in Ukraine, which is to create a much more unified country, anti-Russian, as a result. And I think I mentioned to you that I had some of our folks who had come from Luhansk telling me how amazing it was that I was getting these hugs from these people from eastern provinces, saying thank you to the Americans for all the support we're providing, saving their lives, right? And so, strange dynamic. So I don't see anytime soon, you know, the negotiations happening that lead to peace. But at the end of the day, I expect some point in the future you are going to have to go to the negotiating tables, right? And that'll probably happen when there's some pressure on Ukraine with its partners from the international community, because at the end of the day, they're very, very dependent for the war effort and the humanitarian effort and the reconstruction effort for that continued support. But it would be a mistake for those Western countries to push them too early before they're also ready, because otherwise I think they'll just feel abandoned and not supported in this context, and probably will lead to results that aren't good for either side. So I don't see it anytime soon, but I also, as a diplomat, can tell you I haven't seen many wars solved through the battlefield.
Yeah, it's very rare. And my very final question for you, there's been a lot of talk and concern about nuclear threat. You know, a lot of saber rattling from Putin. We see this a lot from Putin, from people like Kim Jong-un. But do you think there is a genuine possibility and threat that that Putin and Russia could use nuclear weapons in this war in Ukraine?
I think the possibility is small, but it's not zero. And I think that's what we all have to keep in mind, right? I don't think we should expect it. I think the cost to Russia and Putin will be so high and so overwhelming and galvanizing the rest of the world that's not yet quite there in an anti-Russian way that it would make not a lot of sense. I also think on the battlefield, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? These are territories they want to hold, and they're going to use nuclear weapons on them. Yeah. That being said, we talked about this earlier. We're using Western rational thought here as we kind of do the analysis. There's a lot more at play here. Putin has decided this is a must-win, and if he can't have it, nobody will probably kind of attitude. And to scare the West off, he might try to do that. I would encourage your readers, though, to check out an article written by General Stavridis, Admiral Stavridis, former NATO SACEUR, who wrote about what the West should do and make clear now that they would do if tactical nuclear weapons were used. And it was a long list of things, including providing longer range missiles and stuff that could potentially be used against Russian warships and so forth. So I think his idea was you have to really make it clear this isn't just about some additional economic sanctions, or you have to rough out another winter or two before we forget. There has to be a cost that is overwhelming to this, and I think that's what's going to be important for Western nations to make clear to Russia that this just is not worth it and can't be tolerated during this time. So I think it's worrisome. It's possible, but I would say at this point in time, it looks more like bluffing and attempts to kind of push the West away rather than serious.
Yeah, and as you say, it also is heavily reliant on someone who isn't necessarily stable, who is unpredictable. Perhaps you could help by sending one of your psychologists to have a chat with Putin, maybe sit him down in the leather chair, and we can end this war that way.
Yeah. Well, let's hope cooler heads prevail. Let's hope that soon, when Russia realizes that this war is not advancing their interests and actually currently working against their interests, and if they don't pull back soon, they're actually going to have a permanent break in their relationship, in the sense of that Russia and Ukraine will never be able to be friends again, which is not in their interest. They have strong cultural ties, they're neighbors economically, geographically, and so forth. That what needs to happen is not just therapists, but some cool-headed, rational thinking that they're not advancing the interests that they set out to advance. They need to come up with a different strategy than this conventional war that they're pursuing right now. Yeah.
Well, listen, Daniel, thanks so much for your time today.
Jay, I wanted to just give you a plug while I still have you here, which is the Kyiv Post is just such an important news outlet for all of us watching what's going on in Ukraine and in the war there. As an English-speaking outlet, many NGOs, international NGOs, I know governments and others, regular citizens come to your site to make sure we find out what's happening, because the in-depth reporting gives us a lot more than the international news outlets in terms of a lot more detail. So I wanted to thank you for that. Keep up the work. I know it's not easy doing that. Also,
really
thanks for the plugs for us.
Yeah, no problem. Listen, the work you're doing is absolutely amazing. And if it wasn't for people like you and organizations, the suffering that people are going through right now could be far, far worse. So I commend you fully for that, and hope that our audience will click on your website, get into their pockets, and also learn a bit from your website about what people are going through. So Daniel, let's keep in touch anyway. And thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you, Jay. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Daniel. Speak to you soon.
Thanks very much for watching. Remember, click the subscribe button and don't miss out on our coverage of the war here in Ukraine.